In this video, you'll learn how to style components using CSS Modules and Sass. You'll also learn how to override component styling for one-off variations. My name's Larry, and this is Digital Logic. So I've got a new React project open and the development server up and running. Open up the app.js file and the app.css file. Styling a component is a simple enough task. All you need to do is create a CSS file, import that file into your component, and assign the class names to the JSX elements. One thing to keep in mind is that CSS classes are available globally, so any component can use any one of these CSS classes. This also means that if two components define the same class name, one will override the other. A simple solution to avoid this is to scope all class names to the component that uses it. Notice in the app.css file that all class names are scoped to the app component. So let's start off by removing the content within the header tag. And remove the import for the image. And then remove the classes from the app.css file that we no longer need. And then close the app.css file and open up the index.css file. Before we start building any components, it's a good idea to apply a CSS reset. This will generate an error, but it is pretty easy to disable. If you're in VS Code, click on File, Preferences, Settings, and then search for @rule. And then change the setting for the CSS unknown @rule from warning to ignore. I'm also going to change the default box sizing from content box to border box. And then define another rule so that every element and every pseudo element will inherit the same box sizing rule. To verify that the CSS reset has been applied to your app, open the header tag in the HTML page, and then open the first style tag that you find. All of these where rules are provided by the CSS reset. And if you scroll down through the style tag, you'll see the box sizing rule that we just added, along with the other rules that are included in the index.css file. So anyway, let's go ahead and create a new component. So open up the project manager and then create a new folder, which I'll name components. And then create a new component, which I'll name toggle. And then create the CSS file for the toggle component. I'm going to use CSS modules for this component, and to do that, all you need to do is add the .module before the .css. Back in the toggle.jsx file, add the component's function, and then destructure the props object. We'll need a checked property, an onChange property, and that'll be it for now. And return a new JSX object. Create a label element, an input element, and set the type to checkbox. Set the checked property to the checked parameter, and the onChange property to the onChanged parameter. And export the component. Back in the app component, add the toggle component to the header tag. Make sure to add the import statement for the component. Now create a state variable, is checked, and set it equal to useState, and set the initial value to false. Create an event handler, which I'll name handle toggle, and set it equal to useCallback. Pass in a new function, and then pass in an empty array for the dependency array. Within the event handler, call setChecked and set it equal to e.target.checked. Pass in the state variable and the event handler to the toggle component. and then open the toggle components CSS file. Define a toggle class, and then a toggle class with an input selector. Set the visibility of the input element to hidden, and set the width and height to 0. In the toggle class, set the position to relative, set the width to 100 pixels, and the height to 50 pixels, and set the background color to gray, and give it a border radius of 25 pixels. Back in the toggle component, import the CSS file. Because I'm using the module CSS, I need to give the import a name, which I'll call Styles. Add the class name property to the label component, and within curly brackets, specify styles.toggle. Save the file and check out the results in the browser. Select the toggle element in the DOM, and you can see the class name assigned to the label element. So with the CSS Modules component, class names are automatically scoped to the component, and we also get a random cache busting hash at the end. This makes it impossible for us to predictably guess what a component's class name will be. Back in your IDE, add a margin to the component with 10 pixels on the top and bottom, and 5 pixels to the left and right. Add a toggle class selector, and we're going to select the after pseudo element. Define the content property, and set it to an empty string. Set the position to absolute, the width to 40 pixels, and the height to 40 pixels. Set the border radius to 50%, and then set the background color to white. Set the top position to 5 pixels, and the left position to 5 pixels. Set the transition duration property to 200 milliseconds. Add a transition timing function of ease in. And back in the toggle class, add in a transition duration of 200 milliseconds. If I can trigger a transition using CSS selectors only, I'm going to take that approach, but it's not always possible. In this case though, it is. So define the toggle class, and then use the has selector. We want to know that the input element is checked, and then select the after pseudo element. Add a transform with a translate x by 50 pixels. Save the file and check out the results. Unfortunately, the has selector has limited support, so this may not work for you depending on when you watch this video. So because it has limited support, I'll remove this class and replace it with a new class, active. I also want to change the background color of the component when it is checked. So add the toggle class with the active class together and set the background color to a deep sky blue. Now we just need to add the active class to the label component whenever the toggle button is checked. The styles.toggle variable will resolve to a string value, so to add an additional class to the component, all we need to do is concatenate the class names. Just make sure to include a space between each class. Now the component is always toggled on. I only want the active class to be applied when the checked variable is true, and we can do this with a simple ternary expression. If checked is false, return an empty string. Make sure to surround the expression with parentheses, because the ternary operator has a lower precedence than addition. Save the file and check out the results. We can add as many classes as we want with this approach, but it does get a bit tedious. To help us out, open up a terminal and install a new package named ClassNames. Remove the classes from the label component and type ClassNames. And make sure to import the package. Now we can add multiple classes to a component, and ClassNames will perform the string concatenation. To conditionally include a class, add an object to ClassNames. The key is the name of the class, and the value is the condition. Save the file and check out the results. And it works as expected. The basic toggle component is done. So back in the app.js file, duplicate the toggle component. And for this duplicate, I want to override the background color. How can I do that? One option is to define an inline style on the component. Pass in an object, and the key will be the property I want to override, which is the background color. And then I'll set it to the color black. Save the file, and you'll notice that nothing has changed. Open the toggle component, and first you'll notice that I forgot to assign the rest parameter to one of the JSX elements. So I'll pass it into the input element using the spread parameter. Save the file, and you'll notice that the inline style has been added to the input element. I want it on the label component. So add a style parameter to the toggle component, and then assign it to the label element. Save the file, and the background for the toggle component is now black. I don't want the background to be that dark, so I'll pick something a little lighter. Copy the hex value, and then paste it into the inline style. The other problem is that the background color doesn't change when the toggle button is on. So to change the background color, just use a ternary expression. Bring in the state variable, and if it's true, wait, this should be is checked. And if it's true, I'll set the background color to red. If it's false, it'll be gray. And I'll change the red color so it's a little less bright. Copy the hex code and paste it into the inline style. Some of the limitations of inline styling is that we cannot affect pseudo states, pseudo elements, or use the important keyword. So let's duplicate the toggle component again, and this time we'll override the styling using CSS classes. Now there's no way for us to know the class name that will be generated on the label element. CSS Modules adds a cache breaking hash that changes every time the CSS file is modified. So what we have to do is inject a new class into the component that has a higher level of specificity to override the styles. But before we get to that, I'm going to convert the app's CSS file to use CSS Modules. Now update the import in the app.js file. And then update the class names in the CSS file. Finally, assign the class names to the JSX elements. Create a new class for the toggle component and set the background property to a random color. I'll go with coral. Create an active class and set the background color to a dark green. Now we just need to pass these classes into the toggle component. So define a class name property and set it equal to class names. Make sure to include the import, and then pass in styles.toggle, and then a new object to conditionally apply the styles.active class. Notice that the class name property went to the input element. So open up the toggle component and add a class name property to its parameter. and then pass the class name parameter to the label element. Save the file, and you'll notice that the component's background color has changed, but not when I toggle the component on. Modify the CSS so that if both the toggle and active classes are on the same component, the background will be dark green. But if I refresh the browser, you'll see that the component goes back to the way it was before. This happens because both classes have the same level of specificity, and the styles defined in the toggle component come after the styles defined in the app component, giving it a higher level of precedence. For the override classes to take precedence, all we need to do is increase their specificity by defining them as children of the header class. Save the file and check out the results. Because CSS Modules prepends the component name to the class, it's real easy to identify which classes come from the toggle component and which classes come from the app component. In this example, it was pretty easy to override the component because there was only one element within the component that we needed to provide the overrides to. But how do we provide overrides to a more complex component that has several different elements within it? To see how to do this, create a new component, which I'll name Input. This time, I'm going to use sass to style the component. Sass is a CSS preprocessor, and the syntax is pretty similar to CSS. But if you prefer to use CSS, then go for it. To use sass, we need to install an additional package. So open up a terminal and type npm install sass. Create the component's function, and destructure the props parameter. We'll need a label property, a value property, an onChange event listener, an error message, and that is it for now. And then return a new JSX element. I'll wrap the component in a div and define a label element. Pass the label text down to it, and then create a new input element. Set the value property, the onChange event listener, and that's it for now. Add a span element to display the error message. Finally, export the component. Back in the app.js file, remove the toggle components and replace it with the app component. Make sure to include the import at the top of the file. Set the label property to email address. And before we continue, we need to create a state variable and an event handler. I'll name the new state variable input and set it equal to useState, and then pass in an empty string as the initial value. Create an event handler and set it equal to useCallback, and pass in a new function with a single parameter to get access to the event object. Call setInput and set its value to e.target.value. Then pass in an empty array as the dependency array to useCallback. Back to the input component, add the value property and set it equal to the input state variable. Set the onChange event listener to the handleInput function. And set the error message to the text invalid email address. Back in the input component, import the styles from the sass file. In the component style sheet, create a field class, a label class, and an error class. In the field class, add a nested input selector. The equivalent CSS selector would look like this. Back in the input component, add the CSS classes to the different JSX elements. So I'll start with the wrapping div, and then use the ClassNames function to assign multiple classes to this element, and then assign the field class. Moving on to the label element, define the class name property and set it equal to ClassNames, and then I'll reformat the code real quick to make it a little easier to read. And then assign the label class to the label element. Skip the input element for now and go down to the span element and assign the class name property and set it equal to ClassNames, and then assign the error class. Inside the field class, set the position to relative. In the input element, set the border to none, the padding to 12 pixels, the border radius to 5 pixels. In the field class, set the font size to 16 pixels. In the input element, set the font size to 16 pixels as well. In the label class, set the position to absolute, set the top to 50%, and the color to gray. The percentage unit in CSS is a bit tricky. Depending on what it's applied to, it'll change its behavior. In this case, it'll set the element's top position to 50% of the parent element's height. But I want the label to be centered within the field element, so add a transform, translate y, -50%. This will move the label up 50% of its height. In the error class, set the position to absolute. Set the top to 100%. And the left and right to 0. Set the color to red, and it's a little bright, so I'll adjust it. That looks pretty good to me. Copy the hex code and paste it into the sass file. Set the text align property to right, and set the font size to 12 pixels. Increase the top property to 110% to move the element down a little bit more. On the label element, set the left property to 12 pixels. When I click on the input element, I want the label to move up and out of the way. Inside the field class, we're going to select the input element when it's in focus, plus the label class. The plus symbol is the direct sibling selector, so in order for this to work, I need to move the label element so that it comes after the input element. Now set the transform, translate y property to a -250%. When I click on the input element, the label moves up and out of the way, but let's make it a little bit better. Add a transition duration property to the label element and set it to 200 milliseconds. That's a bit better, but we can improve it even more. Let's also add a scale to the label's transform. So I'll set the default scale of 1, and then the input focus class, set the scale to 0.85. Now when I click on the input element, the label moves up and scales, but it's not quite right. In the label class, set the transform origin property to top left. Now that's better. Let's change the color of the label when the input element has focus. It's a little bit too bright, so I'll just turn it down a little bit. Now when I click on the input element and add some text, and then click off the input element, you'll notice that the label moves back over the text. That's not what I want. To fix this, we'll have to add another class, and I'll call it active. We actually don't need the label to be part of the selector, because the active class is a child of the field class, so it already has a higher specificity than the label class by itself. Now conditionally add the active class to the label element when the value is a truthy value. And that did the trick. If I remove the text from the input element, the label moves back down to where it's supposed to be, so it's functioning as expected. Now go back to the app.js file and duplicate the input element. And it looks like I need to add a margin to the input element. So in the field class, add a margin property and set the top and bottom to 20 pixels and the left and right to 5 pixels. I also want to decrease the distance that the label element is from the input element. So in the translate y property, change it to a negative 225%. Now let's say, for some weird reason, we want to change the color of the error message on the second input element from red to blue. How would we do that? The input component is far more complex than the toggle component, consisting of several different elements within it. So we need a way to be able to target an override to a specific element within it. Before we move on, I'm going to assign the rest parameter to the input element. Let's also grab the class name property from the input element. We need a way to pass class overrides to the different individual elements within this component. An easy way to do this is to define a new object as a parameter to the input component. You can name it whatever you want, but I'll go with classes. And make sure to set the default value of it to an empty object. To make this component easier to use, we're going to install the new package. Open up a terminal and type npm install prop types. Prop types makes it easy to define constraints for the properties of a component. In this case, I'm going to use it to make sure that the class's object conforms to a specific shape, and if it doesn't, prop types will generate an error. To use prop types, all you need to do is define the prop type property on the component's function, or class if you're using class-based components. The prop that I want to check is the class's property, and set it equal to prop types, and make sure to include the correct import for the package. So the type will be prop types.shape, and then pass in a new object. In this object, we'll have a field key, and it'll be set to prop types.string. We'll need a label key, which will again be prop types.string, an input key, which will be prop types.string, and an error key, which is again prop types.string. In the components wrapping div, I'll add an additional class, which will be classes.field. In the input element, define a class name property, and then we're going to use the class names function, pass in the class name property from the input component, and then the classes.input property. Within the label element, add the classes.label property to the class name list. In the span element, add the classes.air property to the class name list. All right, back into the app.js file, we need to open the app.module.css file, and I'll move it over to the right panel. So I want to override the color of the error message in the second input element. So all we need to do is define a class that has a higher level of specificity than the existing input error class. So define two new classes, .field and .error, and then set the color to a deep sky blue. On the input component, define a class's property and set it equal to a new object. Define an error key and set it equal to styles.error. Define a field key and set it equal to styles.field. Save the file and check out the results. So at this point, it's pretty easy to overwrite any styling that you want on the input component. All you need to do is define classes that have higher levels of specificity than the existing classes on the input component, and then pass them through the class's object. Well, that is it for this video. If you like this video, then please like, share, subscribe. If you want to support the creation of these videos, then check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.